Hello, you lovely lot, or should I say howdy y'all, and welcome back to a brand new video here on my Stagey YouTube channel. Today, if it wasn't already obvious, I will be sharing with you all of my thoughts and feelings on the current UK tour of Calamity Jane starring Carrie Hope Fletcher. If you're new here, then let me bring you up to speed with how this is going to work. My name is Flora, if you didn't already know, and I have lots, and I mean lots of opinions about theatre. Opinions many feel that I'm unqualified to have, but I like to share them with the internet anyway. I like my reviews to give you guys a little bit of context on the show that I'll be reviewing, including things like the synopsis and the background of the show, before I dive in and break it down into what my highlights and my lowlights were, basically what I liked and what I didn't. Everything shared in this review is honestly nothing but my own opinion, and you are more than entitled to disagree with me and share all your own thoughts and feelings down in the comments. There will be spoilers for the majority of the show, so if you don't want the show spoiled, maybe this is not the review for you. But now that that little kind of disclaimer is out of the way, let's get on with the show. And first things first, a little bit of background on the production itself. This 2025 UK tour production of Calamity Jane is based off of the 2014 Watermill Theatre production. However, the staged musical itself in general is actually based off of a 1953 Doris Day movie of the same name, which if you haven't seen, literally what are you doing with your life? In my opinion, it's one of the best movies ever made. And the movie itself is actually inspired by a real frontierswoman named Martha Jane Canary, better known as Calamity Jane. The 2014 Watermill production of the musical Calamity Jane was, of course, not the first staged musical adaptation of this movie, with the first dated production taking place in 1961 in Fort Worth, Texas. It is a show that has failed to make it to Broadway and so has largely in the USA just been staged at a more regional or amateur level. The show got its start in the UK in 1974 with a production at the Leicester Crucible, and this 2025 UK tour follows in the footsteps of a number of successful UK tours since the first UK tour in 1979. It did also have a brief off-West End run. Oh, and a short Australian tour too. The musical has of course evolved a few times given how long it has been running. It of course made many changes to adapt something that was previously on a screen to bring it onto a stage, but I think the change most noticeable to people is the addition of new songs, all of which were supposedly written for the original 1953 movie but never included. The 2025 UK tour started on the 14th of January 2025 and is currently touring through until the 20th of September 2025, stopping at a number of locations around the UK. But now with that little bit of background on the show out of the way, I reckon a number of you are probably sat there wondering what on earth Calamity Jane is about. Calamity Jane is a musical set in the 1870s out in the Dakota territories of the American Wild West. Now, Dakota probably sounds very familiar to a lot of you guys who know anything about the US's geography, and that's because today we currently have South Dakota and North Dakota, although the Dakota territories at the time also encompass states like Nebraska, Wyoming, and Montana. The show is predominantly set in a town called Deadwood, which was a gold mining town, which to this day still resides in South Dakota. And of course, the musical tells the tale of our namesake character Calamity Jane. The story of our show is basically set into motion when there is a mix-up regarding a performer who is scheduled to be performing at the Golden Garter, the kind of bar/theatre that Deadwood City had. Because of this mix-up, the patrons of the saloon turn on Henry Miller, the owner of the Golden Garter and a friend of Calamity Jane. So Calamity steps in and claims that she is going to secure for the Golden Garter an actress and performer named Adelaide Adams, who is like the it girl of the time. So off Calamity goes to Chicago to get this Adelaide Adams and bring her back to save Millie. Now, despite her best intentions, Calamity Jane doesn't end up securing Adelaide Adams to bring back to Deadwood. She in fact mistakes Adelaide Adams' maid, Katie Brown, for Adelaide and brings Katie instead. When Katie confesses eventually that she is not the star Adelaide Adams, Calamity once again steps in to save the day and convinces the patron of the Golden Garter and the folks of Deadwood to give Katie a chance to be a star. Katie soon wins the heart of every man in town, including Second Lieutenant Danny Gilmartin, who Calamity Jane has a bit of a crush on. Encouraged by Katie, Calamity sheds her tomboy rough-shooting persona. It's when Calamity realizes that Danny and Katie have something going on that she turns a little bit blind with jealousy and ends up causing another ruckus until Wild Bill Hickok swoops in and makes Calamity realize that he is who her heart has really belonged to all along. So in short, it's kind of like a musical western, but also like a love triangle rom-com. Yeah, that's probably the easiest way to describe it. But you might also be wondering, Flora, we now know the background of the show as well as what it's about, but have you ever seen it before? I always like sharing my prior experiences with a show before giving you guys my review so you know exactly where I am coming from before I talk at length about what I liked and what I didn't like. Now, if I haven't made it obvious enough already, Calamity Jane is one of my all-time favourite movies. I first watched it with my granddad and later my mum when I was like, I can't have been more than 8 years old, and Doris Day just made me fall in love with the character of Calamity Jane. Though I think my crush on Howard Keel is genuinely what brought me back to watch it over and over again. I really liked that Calamity was one of the guys, but that didn't stop her from having these more feminine moments, whilst ultimately she realized she could be feminine and she could be loved and she could be more of a traditional woman whilst not giving up any of her wilder side, and I loved that Bill loved her for that. It's also a musical soundtrack that I have known off by heart for many years, and I've even been fortunate enough to travel to South Dakota and visit Deadwood City myself. Whilst I was there, I got to see one of the many stagecoaches that operated on the Cheyenne to Deadwood route, which is where the Deadwood stage comes from. I also got to visit the site of Saloon 10, where the real Wild Bill Hickok was fatally shot in a poker game. And of course, we took a drive through the Black Hills. And yes, I may or may not have listened to a Calamity Jane song or two whilst on this adventure. So that's right, in my family, the Calamity Jane love runs extremely deep. I have never actually seen a staged version of Calamity Jane before, so seeing it on the UK tour was a first for me. I have seen Carrie Hope Fletcher previously. I saw her both in the original Other Palace run of Heathers as well as the original Haymarket run of Heathers. I know, big musical theatre kid flex. So I'm very familiar with her as a performer. But aside from that, I went into the theatre with nothing but my love for the movies and my very high hopes for a brilliant evening. So let's see exactly what I thought of Calamity Jane the musical. Starting, of course, with my highlights. The first highlight for me today is going to be the set. It was so simple yet so effective. You basically had two sort of western town log cabin style facades on either side with a stage at the back that formed the bulk of the set, which was then accented throughout the show with additional chairs and barrels. From the Golden Garter to Calamity Jane's cabin to a military ball, all the different locations felt unique and identifiable without drastically changing the set. Given how many different locations the story of Calamity Jane has as visit, I think this set did a really brilliant job of taking the audience there. It was all very simple yet very effective. My favorite detail was the hand-painted fabric backdrop at the back of the stage on the stage, which would change with each scene. I think this, combined with the set not relying on big flashy gimmicks and lots of lights and technology, really helped sell the feel of the 1870s. This hand-painted cloth scenery in the background was the typical sort of set you might have seen in a real theatre like the Golden Garter back then. So I love that set designer Matthew Wright decided to include this, as it was gorgeous. I also love the way they brought several modes of transport to life, the Deadwood stage being one of them, which was formed by combining things like the barrels and the piano to make the shape of a stagecoach, whilst at the same time having the performers kind of bounce their shoulders so it simulated this movement of the stagecoach, along with, of course, the tried and true coconut horse hooves. It really did help bring this feeling and sense of travel and movement when there was literally very little going on the stage, and so I thought that was fantastic. There was even a moment where Calamity travelled by train from Cheyenne to Chicago, which was achieved really simply by having performers line up their chairs, again kind of moving their bodies as though you might on a train that's swaying on the tracks, and then having Rattlesnake, one of the characters in the show, stand at the front smoking his pipe like the puffing of a steam train. I thought this was a brilliant little detail. All of these clever tricks I think really took advantage of the limitations posed by touring a show in which you can't drag along these massive pieces of set with you, and it resulted in some brilliantly creative solutions to these problems, and I think the show honestly was better for it. The second highlight for me is definitely going to be the dance numbers in the show. I feel like so many modern musicals no longer take the time to include dance numbers like this, at least not in the same way that older musicals do, and so I really appreciated that there were several moments in the show for dancing, from including the iconic Windy City tap dance that Calamity does, to the full-on country reels happening at the military ball. There was a lot going on for the audience to feast their eyes on. The dancing all felt very 1870s, with vaudeville style numbers being done by Katie Brown and Francis Fryer, as well as very western feeling country reels and line dancing being featured at other points. There were other moments of dance and movement too that weren't necessarily big dance breaks, but this included the ensemble dancing around the Golden Garter during several musical numbers, which I think made for a far more visually interesting stage setup than just folks stood there playing instruments and singing. It felt really dynamic and lively, and I loved watching that. The only time all of this dancing really felt unnecessary was during the song Woman's Touch. Katie Brown had a small dance break, which I know was there to allow Carrie Hope Fletcher time to do a costume change, but it just felt like the dance number went on for like a little bit too long. To me, I feel like it could have been a couple bars shorter, but I'm aware that Carrie Hope Fletcher couldn't just movie magic her way into a new outfit. She did actually need the time to change it, so I can't begrudge this too much. I honestly went into the show not knowing whether to expect a whole lot of dancing, so I was, like I said, really pleasantly surprised that it was included. I think Nick Winston, the choreographer, did a great job of blending 1870s inspired dancing with more country inspired dances to really bring the show to life, as well as reaffirm to audiences that they're watching a show set in an 1870s frontier town. Moving on to our third highlight, I'd really like to highlight the changes that were made. And I feel like a lot of people often grumble about changes made to musicals or media when it is adapted from one form into another, but I think this show did a really fantastic job. I'm well aware that due to the original Calamity Jane movie having come out in 1953, the movie doesn't hold up brilliantly, particularly its depictions of and the characters' attitudes towards Native Americans. So I did know to expect some changes regarding this. Sometimes when a show makes changes, it can end up feeling really forced and heavy-handed, particularly if you have an audience that is really familiar with the source material. But I'm really happy to say that aside from what I thought was one really clunky lyric change, the changes were by and large done in a way that felt really seamless and fluid with the flow of the show. My favorite change was to the scene where Bill has to dress up in a costume following his loss of a bet to Calamity. He now dresses up as Queen Victoria after losing this bet, and it was honestly one of my favorite costumes in the show. It was beautifully designed and had this like cobbled together DIY feel to it. Plus there was something quite funny about seeing a depiction of Queen Victoria with twin revolvers around her hips. I think all of the changes made were of course necessary changes, but I do appreciate that they were done in a way that didn't overly impact or affect or change the sort of source material itself. There were a handful of changes I was less keen on, which I will talk about later in my lowlights category, but overall I was pleasantly surprised by how well these changes fit and flowed with the story of Calamity Jane. And then moving on to our final highlight, I definitely want to talk about the cast itself. They were such a joy to watch on stage. I love that the decision was made for this show to take advantage of actor musicians. I think this choice really contributed to a close-knit community feel amongst the cast members on the stage. I also really loved the way that the musicians would sort of linger in scenes that they weren't directly involved in, which I think added to this feel of it being a small mining town where everyone's up in each other's business even if they're not supposed to be. It also allowed all of the cast members to have more stage time, given that the majority of the time the musicians were there even if they weren't directly involved in a scene. Of course, like I said earlier, I knew going into this that Carrie Hope Fletcher would absolutely kill in the role of Calamity, but the sheer joy she seemed to have in playing this role was just downright infectious. It just drew you in to every moment, and I loved that. Her energy playing against Vinny's Bill too was brilliant, given that the Calamity Jane Bill Hickok pairing is one that I've loved for ages. For a bit of context, if you've not seen it, it's giving like Benedict and Beatrice from Much Ado About Nothing, or like Han and Leia from Star Wars. I was so worried that this spark between them wouldn't come across on stage in the same way it does maybe between Doris Day and Howard Keel in the movie, but I think Carrie and Vinny absolutely nailed it. I was obsessed. Everyone on stage was giving the show literally their all, and their passion and love for performing the material I think really came across to the audience, and that is always something I absolutely adore to see, because I feel like I definitely have seen some shows where it feels like people are kind of half-arsing it, but that was not the case here. Everyone was amazing. But those are all of my highlights for Calamity Jane the musical. So with those out of the way, let's get on to what I thought the lowlights of Calamity Jane were. I think the first low light for me is definitely going to be the new songs, and obviously I'm saying new because like I said earlier, the songs added to the musical for the stage adaptation are supposedly songs that were once written for the original movie and just never used. The songs themselves weren't actually all that bad. In fact, there were several of them that I really enjoyed, which included the songs Men and Careless with the Truth. I think the issue I took with a lot of them is the fact that they just did very little to move the story along, and I really felt like we were seeing cut down versions of the songs that were included in the original musical to make time for these new songs. Now, the songs included in the original musical were between 2 and 6 minutes long, depending on which edit of them you chose to listen to, but it felt like watching this that in the stage musical they'd all been really cut down to like a verse and a chorus to make time for, like I said, these other songs, all of which felt longer. Okay, so they might have felt longer because I was hearing them for the first time and therefore my brain didn't kind of know the flow of the song like I do with the songs that I do know. However, the only original original songs that we really got in full were I Could Do Without You and I Just Blew In From the Windy City, which is a shame because to me, the songs in Calamity Jane are just so good. And following on from that, if the songs that they added into the musical were songs originally cut from the movie, maybe that was your sign because they were cut for a reason. I also think cutting some of the songs meant that we missed out on brilliant moments from the movie that I was kind of hoping would have been included in the stage show. I think the one that really stands out to me is Hive Full of Honey, which is a song sung by Francis, a character I will talk more about later. But basically, he ends up being forced onto the stage in drag, and in the movie, he starts out like very unsure, very timid, and then really gets into it up until the point he loses his wig and it is revealed to the audience he is in fact a man. We didn't get that. We never really got the whole like, oh, actually, maybe I kind of like performing in drag moment that we got from the movie, and I missed that. I think it would have been a fun little thing to include, but they couldn't because they didn't have the song runtime to do that. I think we maybe would have been slightly better off if we'd had maybe just 4 new songs as opposed to the 8 that we did get, if you count the number of reprises we had. I think this would allow the story a little bit more time to breathe. We would have been able to hear more of the original songs, but also potentially have the runtime to delve into moments from the movie that maybe could have been expanded upon for storytelling purposes. Because like I said, the new songs weren't necessarily bad. I just think there were too many of them, given that we had to give up so much of the runtime of the original songs to make way for them. But our next lowlight is going to be the changes that I didn't enjoy. Now, I know I changed the praises up above, but there were 2 changes that didn't really float my boat. One being the addition of new characters, namely a character called Sue and her subsequent relationship with Francis, and 2 being the change that happened to Danny Kilmartin when his character is introduced to us. Starting up with the change that added in characters like Sue. Because sometimes adding characters isn't a bad thing, it can be beneficial. I just don't think it was in this instance. Now, Sue is added, and I think she is supposed to be the niece of Henry Miller, the guy that owns the Golden Garter, and I literally could not tell you what purpose she served to the story, aside from divvying up how many lines Henry Miller got to say. You could have cut Sue's character and the plot would not have changed. I also really did not like the relationship they tried to establish between Francis and Sue. I really like Francis both in the movie and I liked his character in the stage show. However, the character was very queer-coded in my opinion, more so than he is in the movie, but he just ends up with Sue. I also think they took up way too much time on stage, and their side plot took away from areas of the musical that I think could have been furthered or developed upon elsewhere. I really do think that the inclusion of Sue's character and their like weird romance subplot, despite Francis quite clearly being painted as like an effeminate gay man, really kills the fun for me of Francis's character. Like I said, the Hive Full of Honey scene really does show Francis coming into his own and kind of vibing with the fact that like he's performing as a woman. Yet because this doesn't happen and then you go and make him, you know, get with Sue, really just kind of kills the character. I just think it was such an unnecessary subplot when we already have plots like the Katie Danny Kilmartin plot that could have been expanded upon further, or the relationship between Calamity and Katie that we could have explored a little bit more. I feel like we just wasted so much time shoehorning in this romance for 2 characters that realistically don't influence the plot all that much, that could have just been better spent elsewhere. So I don't really see why Sue was added as opposed to just add another female talking role, if that makes sense. And then the second change to Danny and Calamity's introduction was another one I didn't love. For those unfamiliar with the movie, we are introduced to Calamity Jane's relationship to Danny Kilmartin when we find out alongside Calamity that Danny is being held captive by some Native Americans after these Native Americans supposedly attacked Danny and his men whilst they were out on a patrol. Upon hearing this, Calamity wastes no time, nor does she really spare a thought for her own safety before she runs, grabs a horse, and rushes off to save Danny. The musical has changed this so that Danny comes into the Golden Garter being carried by another soldier. He's covered in injuries and explains that bandits attacked them. Calamity then offers to patch him up before the doctor is called to do so in her place. Now, I am very happy that they changed it from the Native Americans attacked us thing, because that was not okay. But I do think changing it into the scene they changed it into took a little bit of something away from Calamity's character. Calamity is shown both in the musical and the movie to sort of really talk up her exploits, with the reaction from characters around us signaling to the audience that she might be exaggerating a touch. I feel like in the movie, Calamity's exaggerations are very much balanced out by the fact that we see her go off and do things, such as pulling off the stunt of rescuing Danny, because we see her doing stuff that is akin to to the stunts that she describes. In the musical, we obviously don't get that. And so to me, it feels like a change that took a little bit of something away from Calamity's character. It took some ability away from her. Sure, we're told a number of times throughout the musical that Calamity's a good shot, a good horse rider. She does stuff as well as any man. But I think the movie showed us this. Of course, it is very easy to show a daring horse chase on a silver screen as opposed to on a stage. So I can't grumble too much. And likewise, I do appreciate that the effort was made to correct the outdated cultural stereotypes that were presented in the movie. I just wish a change had been made that maybe didn't clip Calamity's wings so much, shall we say. It, to me, undermines her and makes her look like more of a liar than it does in the movies. But that's just my thoughts. Moving on from that, though, I think the next lowlight for me is going to be the costumes. Now, I really did enjoy the costumes in this show, so you're probably wondering, Flora, why is it in the lowlights then? It's specifically the costumes at the military ball that I took issue with, as it really made certain characters for me difficult to pick out from the crowd, particularly Katie Brown. Her costume for me blended in so much with what the ensemble were wearing that she kept getting lost in it, and bearing in mind the military ball is a big moment for Katie, Danny, Calamity and Bill, I think it would have been nice to be able to pick her out just a little bit more easily. Now, the military ball scene is supposed to be this big grand reveal of like, oh wow, Calamity Jane is actually a woman. So I understand giving her a dress that stands out more than everyone else's. All eyes are supposed to be on Calamity in this moment, both within the scene as well as from the audience. I think everyone else just looked so similar in this scene, however, that they kind of became like a homogenous blob. So picking Katie out was quite difficult. But I feel like that is such a nitpick. It just really bothered me throughout the scene, so I thought I would mention it. And then my final lowlight, I think, is going to be a little bit of a difficult one for me to explain, but bear with me, and that is going to be the undertones of the musical. I obviously already touched on it slightly with the way they handle Frances's character, but I must add that I think I was quite disappointed with how the show seemed to lack the same sort of lesbian vibes between Calamity Jane and Katie Brown that we get in the movie. Now, the movie was made in 1953, like I keep saying, so obviously it wasn't actually like a lesbian movie, but to me, when you watch it, there are definitely queer undertones that you can kind of read into what's going on in the scenes, and I was hoping to see some of that in the musical too, so was sad when I didn't. Now, I'm not saying they needed to rewrite the musical to make it this like profound new gay version of Calamity Jane, but given that we didn't really spend a whole lot of the runtime developing a friendship between Calamity and Katie, I shouldn't honestly be surprised that it was really hard to pick out moments that reflected the same love that we see between Calamity and Katie in the movie. It would have been nicer to see more time dedicated to Katie and Calamity's relationship as opposed to, I don't know, wasting time on irrelevant characters that don't move the plot forward. I'm looking at you, Sue. I think this would also have made the breakdown of the friendship that happens in the second act a bit more impactful. And I definitely feel like the relationship, gay or otherwise, between Calamity and Katie was one of the things that suffered most through some of the changes that were made. But no, I think an element of the movie that I really do love is the fact that you can kind of watch it and be like, and she never married, but she lived with her lady friend for her whole life until she died kind of vibes, you know? But the fact that I didn't get those same vibes from the musical to me was just a little bit sad. I would like it to have been just like a little bit more gay. But those were my lowlights. And then I've got another category that I've just kind of called anything else in my notes because they're not really lowlights that I think should detract from the review I give the show, but stuff that I just wanted to kind of highlight, I suppose. The first thing in this anything else category is definitely going to be the sing-along confusion. I couldn't quite convince myself, like I said, to make it a low light, but the show was very confusing at times as to whether we were supposed to or allowed to sing along or not. Each time Black Hills was played, the audience was kind of encouraged to join in, but not like encouraged enough to make it obvious that it was okay. I think if you wanted to include cheeky sing-along moments, either to Black Hills or to any other number in the show, like you can't go wrong with a good mega mix. That's what everyone's doing these days, because you can make it very obvious in those moments that it's okay for people to sing along. So some clarity on the front of whether I was allowed to or supposed to be singing along at moments would have been nice, because I'm too socially nervous to sing along at the theatre unless the cast have gone, you can sing, it's okay, you know, like in Six. And the second thing in my anything else category is going to be this bad boy right here, the souvenir brochure. And I wanted to highlight this because it's lying to you. If Matt Hemley, the man who wrote this section right here, ever sees this video, I want words with you, okay? Because what you wrote in impression that souvenir brochure is giving, I watched a 2-hour documentary that came out in 1984 from CBS, and then maybe you read Duncan Aikman's biography of Calamity Jane called Calamity Jane and the Lady Wildcats, which was released in 1927, and did no other research. Like, if you're gonna make bold claims like you do in the brochure, at least cite your sources, because I've cited mine. They're gonna be in the description so you guys can confirm everything I am about to say. Now, I know a lot of what is known about Calamity Jane is fuzzy and vague at best, mixed up with half-truths and bad record keeping from the time, and maybe a Deadwood fire or two, but there are many things that the historians that have dedicated their lives to learning about the life of the real-life Calamity Jane do agree on. These things can also be found out with relative ease with a few simple Googles. As someone who, if you couldn't tell, went through a really big Calamity Jane phase as a child, I know I definitely have more knowledge about this woman than like the average UK theatre goer, but lots of the information in this souvenir brochure is just factually incorrect. So because the information in the brochure annoyed me so much, you lucky folk are about to get an impromptu Calamity Jane history lesson. So buckle up, kiddos, we're going back in time. Oh, but if you want to skip this and head straight to the end to hear my conclusion, you're more than welcome to, because let's be real, a history lesson about the real life Calamity Jane is probably not what you're here for, but I care about it, so if you want to listen, listen. Let's start off by discussing the fact that a lot of what we know about Calamity Jane comes from a book called The Life and Adventures of Calamity Jane, which is supposedly her own autobiography. That was published around 1896. It was originally sold as a souvenir to one of the traveling Wild West shows that she was part of. This, combined with old records such as newspapers and town records, have all been paired together to allow historians to create a broader picture of who Martha Canary Jane was, even though a lot is still left in mystery. The first false claim I noticed in the souvenir brochure was the claim that Calamity Jane and Wild Bill Hickok had a daughter together after they secretly got married, but like, no, they didn't. We can't even prove that Calamity Jane and Bill Hickok, sorry to spoil your illusions here, were anything more than actually just acquaintances, let alone had a kid together. We do know that Bill and Calamity likely knew each other or knew of each other and arrived at Deadwood City around the same time. In Calamity's autobiography, we do get mention of Bill, claiming that she attacked Bill Hickok's killer with a cleaver, which is possibly one of the many exaggerations in her autobiography, such as the fact she rode with Custer or for the Pony Express, both of which are likely very untrue. A few brief newspaper clippings from around June and July of 1876 also confirm the arrival of the pair, some saying they arrived together and others saying they didn't. Seeing as Wild Bill Hickok died on the 2nd of August 1876, that sure didn't leave much time for a whirlwind romance, secret marriage, and having a child. In fact, Bill was actually married to a different woman called Agnes Thatcher Lake, of which we do actually have historical confirmation. There are also rumours that Calamity Jane got married to someone else, but I couldn't verify that enough to want to include it, but I'd throw that out there anyway now. The brochure claims that Bill and Calamity actually met in 1870 and had their daughter Janie in 1873, yet in what we can only assume are Calamity's own words in her autobiography, we find out that she claims to have met Bill in Fort Laramie in 1876 prior to riding to Deadwood, and this is one of only a few mentions of the man. If she was so in love with Bill and had a marriage and a family to him, why would she leave such details out of her autobiography? Though I will say, if I was writing an essay on this, I would offer up the academic critique that given that her autobiography was written to be sold as a souvenir to fans of Wild West shows, it's likely she probably didn't include details of her love life, marriage, and family, due to the fact that that's probably not what people wanted when they were buying a souvenir booklet about a hero of the Wild West. They wanted to know about her adventures and her daring rescues and horseback, because who cares for marriage and childbirth when you can read about gunslinging and horseback riding? Now, you're probably sat there wondering, why on earth did people think there was a relationship between Bill and Calamity if none of the facts we actually know about either of them line up to support this? Well, I think it's all to do with the fact that Calamity Jane and Bill, to a degree, have become characters outside of themselves. Calamity really liked to talk and hype herself up, as we know. It's actually later dime novels, which were sort of short paperback books popular in the early 20th century, that really built Calamity into the Western legend that she is considered today. It's likely these dime novels are responsible for a lot of the misinformation we claim to know about Calamity, such as the widely held belief that Calamity and Bill were lovers. Similarly, official biographies such as the one by Duncan Aikman that I mentioned earlier perpetuated this idea of there being some sort of affection or relationship between them. But circling all the way back round, I obviously mentioned that the first fact that they got wrong was this idea that Calamity and Bill had a kid together. So whilst it is speculated that Calamity had anywhere between 2 and 4 kids, not just the one, it is something that historians very much struggle to agree upon. The souvenir brochure makes reference to a daughter called Janie, which seems like like an odd choice to me because this Janie in question was actually a lass called Jane Hickok McCormick. That's a mouthful, let me tell you. She came forward in 1941, so like 38 years after Calamity died, claiming to be the daughter of Calamity and Bill, stating that she was conceived in Montana in 1973 when Bill rendezvoused with Calamity Jane. There is next to zero proof that this Janie, who never went by Janie and actually went by Jane, was actually the daughter of Calamity Jane, because the proof that she produced were letters from Calamity. And it's these letters that are frequently quoted throughout the souvenir brochure. Yet given that most historians agree that Calamity Jane was illiterate, it would have been very hard for her to write a diary or letters for her daughter if she did have one. And in more recent times, Calamity Jane historian James McLaird has all but disproven McCormick's letters as forgeries because the dates and events mentioned in the letters don't correlate with the more substantial historic proof we have of Calamity Jane's life. There were other children, like I said, that came forward claiming to be the offspring of Calamity Jane. We had a woman called Maud Weir come forward in 1996, but she could never produce any proof that Calamity Jane was indeed her mother. There are two other children supposedly belonging to Calamity that do have more historical proof that they existed. A boy who died not long after childbirth, and a daughter supposedly named Jessie, with Jessie being the most credible child of Calamity Jane, as there are first-hand accounts from people who knew the pair, as well as several news articles supposedly referencing Calamity Jane's pregnancy. I do find it really interesting that the souvenir brochure chose to highlight Jane of these four suspected children, as well as get her name wrong, and quote letters that have since been assumed to have been fabricated, as it really, in the brochure, paints this picture of Calamity Jane as some sort of mother who lived this wild, unladylike life, yet refused to stop loving her daughter. Like, it feels to me like a very targeted and purposeful portrayal of Calamity Jane in a certain light, because to me, I'm like, at this point, just leave the kids out of it. We don't know if she ever had any, and you're choosing to reference the one child that we think is probably the least credible. Another fact, and the fact to me that I think is most shocking, is the fact that this souvenir brochure gets Calamity Jane's death date wrong, which to me is basic information. So Calamity Jane actually died on the 1st of August 1903, yet this brochure chooses to perpetuate this idea that she died on the 2nd of August 1903, marking 27 years to the day that her beloved Bill died on the 2nd of August 1876. It was actually creative writers that chose to amend the day on which Calamity Jane died to give it this sort of poetic, romantic feel, with it being 27 years to the day that Bill died. Like, oh, it's so cute, it's so romantic, they died on the same day. Like, they just actually didn't. And this is the incorrect fact in the brochure that really irritates me, because it is the one that is probably the easiest to find the answer to. A quick Google could have told you the answer, but also Calamity Jane's grave is still in Deadwood City to this day, and looking at pictures of it, you can clearly see it says the 1st of August. The brochure, I will say, did get a couple of facts right, like how Bill and Calamity are buried side by side in Deadwood, a truth which I think adds to this idea of them being like lovers. And it did also get correct the fact that Calamity Jane used to be a rider as part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, which also in fact actually included the original Deadwood stagecoach, which is why we can still see the Deadwood stage to this day, when many of its kind have been lost to time. For me, these truths are not enough to move past the fact that so much of what is in here is incorrect. I don't think Matt Hemley, the bloke who wrote the piece in here, meant any harm in it, but these facts are so, at least to me, easily checked with a quick trip to Google Scholar, and I think it annoys me that he's perpetuating these myths about Calamity Jane, when so much of what we know about Calamity Jane is already really hard to sift through what is fact and what is myth to begin with. Particularly when a show is introducing a person like Calamity Jane to young audiences for the first time. It's disheartening for the brochure to be so under-researched yet presented so confidently as fact. But also, and this is me being petty, the back of the program literally says, the information in this publication is correct at the time of going to press. It's not. Now, I don't want anyone to panic. The team at Calamity Jane has actually been made aware subsequent to me posting about it on my TikTok and Carrie Hope Fletcher passing it on to them, so hopefully we will see changes in the future. Though if we don't, and you're looking for someone to rewrite the forward of your brochure, you know who to call. I know that was all a rant and literally so irrelevant to what I thought of the show itself, but as you can tell, I have always loved Calamity Jane, both the movie and the real historical figure. So if I can do my part in correcting the factual inaccuracies in this bad boy here, then that's what I'm going to do. And like I said earlier, unlike Matt Henley, all of my sources are cited down below. If you, after hearing all of this, want to learn a little bit more about the real life Calamity Jane yourself, I highly encourage you to do so. She was a fascinating woman. Now, I know this isn't necessarily where you guys thought this review was going, but it's gone there anyway, so thank you for bearing with me through all of this, and for letting me be a little Calamity Jane Wild West nerd for a moment. I appreciate it. Now, if you stuck through the history lesson, well done. Gold Sheriff star for you. But if you didn't, your loss. But all of you, welcome to the end of the video. Let's wrap up all of my thoughts and feelings on the show, shall we? The UK tour of Calamity Jane at its best is a vibrant and nostalgic adaptation of the 1953 film, which brings the charm of this Doris Day production to stage. The cast was brilliantly passionate. I think the creative team did a brilliant job of bringing Deadwood to life as well. And the show really does capture the spirit of a lively Western town. I think it strikes just the right balance between new and old to also have appeal across generations. The seamless modernization of the outdated elements, I think, were handled really well, although, like I said, some of them maybe weren't to my taste or could have been handled better. Despite those drawbacks, though, the production maintains this delightful old school musical feel while still being engaging and energetic in a way that I know younger theatre fans are going to love. But those are all of my thoughts and feelings on the 2025 UK tour of Calamity Jane the musical. A massive thank you to the New Victoria Theatre in Woking for having me along to check this show out to review for you guys. Like I said, this show is touring around venues in the UK until September 2025, so if it's something you want to go and check out for yourself, you definitely have time to. If you've already seen the show and have your own thoughts and feelings, I would love to know what they are in the comments, so make sure you let me know. If it's more chaotic and very opinionated theatre reviews you are after, then make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss more in the future. But that is all from me today, guys, so I will see you in the next one. Bye!